welcome to The Untold with Hevi Buzo. Joining me today is Thomas Duesterberg, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and an expert on trade, manufacturing, economics, and foreign policy. And you've wrote many publications and books about these subjects that we're going to be talking a lot about today, including you've written and talked about the World Trade Organization, the need of reforms there, the relationship trade relationship with Europe and China. And this is way before the whole pandemic happened. First, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure being with you. Thank you for having me.
I do want to kind of talk a little bit of background about what's going on today. Before the pandemic started, and President Trump tweeted about this today also, there was a trade deal with China. And before that, there was all types of problems in a history of China violating international law, trade deals, and stealing Western technology and American technology. Tell us a little bit more about the history behind these violations that China and its Communist Party leadership has been doing.
Well, let's don't go back too far, but let's go back to 40 years ago when China was just coming out of the Maoist era and was terribly poor and underdeveloped. And Deng Xiaoping decided that China ought to get rich and join the developed countries. So he set about a systematic program to achieve that and did so very successfully. China started to make low technology goods. They started to sell a lot to the United States, to Western Europe, to Australia, to Japan, started to produce more and more sophisticated manufactured goods as time went on. In around 1999, China was allowed to come into the World Trade Organization. I think they finally achieved that in the year 2000, which allowed them to have full access to Western markets, East Asian markets, and they continued to develop their industrial sector, started to take huge amounts of market share from United States manufacturing sector, Japanese, the West European manufacturing sector. At the same time, they started a massive program of subsidies to their state-owned corporations and to their privately held firms. They invited Western firms to come into China, but one of the conditions of coming into China to produce there and sell into the local market was that they have Chinese partners and that they transfer technology to China. At the same time, they started rather systematically acquiring Western firms to get high technology products, and they stole quite a bit of very sensitive technologies in aerospace and medical products and industrial goods. One clear example is they allowed the high-speed train companies from Japan and Europe to enter into partnerships. And within 10 years, those companies were largely put out of business because China copied the technology and was able to produce it at a lower cost and drive the Western competitors out of business. So they've done that systematically in industry after industry. Of late, they've had a highly sophisticated program to develop the newest technologies, the cutting edge technologies like 5G communications, advanced semiconductors, commercial airliners, robotics. And again, they use the time-honored tactics that they developed, joint ventures, forced technology transfer, misappropriation of protected intellectual property. So all of these things contributed to a loss of industrial jobs in the West. And that led to a reaction that culminated in the United States in the election of President Trump. who is now systematically fighting back against some of these practices that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So he's imposed tariffs. He's cut off access to some really sensitive technologies by Chinese companies. He's now slowly cutting off access to Western financing, which is going to be important. But all of these things are designed to rebalance the playing field. The hope when China came into the World Trade Organization was that they would adopt systems and laws protecting intellectual property, allowing reciprocal access to their market in return for getting access to ours. They haven't honored those. So that whole consensus that was in favor of working with China has been undermined.
We have now an administration that was willing to confront China on all of these violations that have been happening for, I don't know, decades, and with no response from the Western world. China was allowed to keep violating every trade deal, every agreement. Is that because maybe the thinking of an alternative to this very cheap production was something that the governments didn't want to deal with?
To be fair to previous administrations and to some of our Western allies, we did try to get China to change its behavior through the World Trade Organization. There were dozens of cases of unfair competition of one sort or another, or misappropriation of technology. But unfortunately, the World Trade Organization proved to be unable to get China to change in a fundamental way. We, the United States, have tried to work with our allies, but behind all of this effort is the undeniable fact that China's a big market, 3 billion people. A lot of these people are in the middle class now and are champion consumers. So companies in the United States, Japan, Europe, wanted to have access to that market. And China made it clear that in order to be able to sell into their market or to produce goods theoretically less expensively in China for export back to the United States, that you had to toe to their system of doing things. And it's really only in the last 3 or 4 years that a serious effort has been made to call their bluff, if you will, and show them that it can be painful to use all of these tactics and strategies to undermine our economic strength.
Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit with our listeners and our audience about the 5G technology? There was so many conspiracy theories about the 5G technology being responsible for what's going on and right now, and the people being actually getting sick because of it. A lot of different conspiracy theories, but this is a technology that China basically tried to steal from the United States. It's another technology that it's trying to beat the United States to it without respect to any international law or agreements. What's happened with this, and what is 5G technology?
Well, in short, 5G technology is just a much better way to conduct mobile telecommunications. It's much faster. It's more powerful in the sense that you can have more data flowing across the airwaves than before. So the hope is, and I'm sure it's going to pan out, that it will enable things like the Internet of Things, the so-called Internet of Things. It will be a powerful way to digitize the entire economy, supply chains, but also it will power the development of artificial intelligence, and in turn, all kinds of new applications. You'll be able to download movies in 3 seconds or something like that. The estimates are, anywhere from 10 to 100 times faster than what we have now.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So China it's an interesting case study in the way China operates, because they did decide years ago that they wanted to be a competitor, and that if you could control this 5G technology and get your systems into operation around the world, you could control the flow of data, which is a good thing for those interested in developing artificial intelligence. But it can be used, that data can be used for commercial advantage all over the place. So China subsidized their national champion, Huawei especially, but also a company called ZTE, over the last 20 years to the tune of, the Wall Street Journal estimates, about $70 billion. They did steal technology, but they also did their own research, in fairness to them. So they are able to make both the infrastructure, the backroom equipment, if you will, that goes into making those systems work, and the mobile phones that allow people and products, companies to connect to the internet. So the way it works is they subsidize, they get the technology, then they go out into the marketplace, and they underprice everyone. So right now, the United States no longer has a telecommunications infrastructure integrated supplier. We used to have Bell Labs and AT&T, then I forget the name of the successor company, but there was a Canadian company called Nortel. Lucent Technologies was the AT&T successor. It's now, those no longer exist. They were sold to Nokia. So there are only 2 Western competitors now to Huawei, Nokia and Ericsson, the Swedish company. But neither of them is able to do the sort of research needed to stay way ahead in the technology. Especially because there are just no profits in the market. Huawei goes out there and says, we will build you a system. We'll give you a 30-year loan. The interest rate is 0. And they make their money by operating the system and getting access to to all the data that flows across it. And the nefarious part of that is the fears that have been expressed by the United States especially, is that they will use that to spy on people as well.
Exactly. And I think this is where the scariest thing comes to play, is that we're talking about a regime that has, no respect for human rights, no institutions, no accountability or credibility inside of China, not to mention anywhere else. And we've talked before about the examples of what China has done in other countries where they build infrastructure, but they actually built spying gadgets in everything they built, in Africa, for example.
Right. There was a famous example. They built a new headquarters for the Organization of African Unity, I believe it's called, from the building itself, plus all the information technology. Then about 3 years after it opened, the operators of the facility noticed that in the middle of the night, there were these massive transfers of information to Shanghai. And so they figured out that it was essentially a bugged operation, if you will, and everything that went on in that building, China knew about. And China is very active in Africa. They are going after the mineral resources of Africa very successfully. They want shipyards, ports. They want to sell into those markets. But they're rare commodities like cobalt, which is essentially essential to battery technology and therefore to autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles going forward. China now controls something like 80% of the mining of cobalt in the world, 60 to 80%. A lot of that is in Africa. So it's an integrated strategy that they have.
This is a very scary and dark scenario that we're talking about, because this is a country that has over 1 million people in concentration camps because they're Muslim. Now, today, commits violations of human rights across the spectrum, and it has a world record of violations in terms of human rights and other issues globally. And if they do take advantage of this Western technology, this could put the entire world at risk. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Well, that's part of their strategy. I mean, we are fighting back. But it's true that China has systematically undermined human rights within its own, what it considers its own borders, and that includes Tibet, which a lot of people think shouldn't be part of China, and they basically destroyed the Tibetan culture. Now they're doing the same in the Uyghur territory in Xinjiang, which you mentioned. They're now squeezing Hong Kong. They're looking at Taiwan. They're very active in the oceans around China. They're getting control of ports. They're harassing the waters around Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia to discourage them from drilling for oil, for fishing in those areas. And a very large portion of world trade goes across the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So if China is able to gain control of those areas, then it's very important. So they're, and they have a land version of that called the Belt and Road Initiative. Railroads already going into Western Europe and the
Exactly.
Like. And the problem is that every time China reaches out in a friendly way to help another country build infrastructure, there are big strings attached to it, which countries are just waking up to.
To the Chinese influence and everything that comes with that. And then we know, like you said, Western Europe, there are countries who have been now basically having some sort of Chinese influence. The same thing in the Middle East, where China is also trying to invest and open up. And this is all a danger to these countries. And this is all before the pandemic. So, I mean, we did not even start now with a pandemic that also showed, according to some sources, that the countries that had the best or closest ties to China had the worst cases, such as Iran, Italy. Now we know Russia, that is not transparent about the numbers, but we know that it's spreading wild in Russia. But I mean, this is also kind of showing and manifesting itself in this pandemic.
Well, that was Italy is a good example, because the area of Italy that was affected and just devastated is northern Italy, the heart of their traditional textile industry, which is now increasingly controlled by the Chinese. So there's lots of travel back and forth, and the consequences were dire. I would say one of the impacts of of how the pandemic has unfolded is a lot of people who were willing to work with China in Western Europe, in Southeast Asia, India, have recognized that China was not very forthcoming at all about what was going on within China, and allowed the virus to spread. And they've tried to cover that up ever since. And they have not been very helpful in gaining cooperation to get a scientific understanding of this. So the impact of this, I think, is going to be increasing distrust of China. You can see that a lot in Europe. In the United Kingdom, for instance, they decided that they would use some Huawei technology in their telephone system, but there's been a revolt within the Conservative Party, apparently, since the pandemic started, to rethink that decision. And a lot of this has to do with just a lack of trust that has ballooned because of the way China handled the pandemic and the virus spreading outward from China.
I do want to talk about how this pandemic, basically first, in your opinion, how did China respond or not respond in the right way to let the world know about what happened in Wuhan? And afterwards, we will talk about the implications of this pandemic on the world relationship with China going forward.
Well, I mean, the answer to the first question is very simple. China did everything it could to hide the fact that the pandemic was growing in Wuhan and in the provinces around Wuhan. And that had devastating consequences for the rest of the world because it inevitably spread. China cordoned off the province that Wuhan is in, but they allowed international flights to leave from China. And so a lot of those flights were going to the they went everywhere. United States, both coasts, Australia, Western Europe, United Kingdom. And so people now recognize that China made a grave mistake and did a grave disservice by hiding the early development of this of the pandemic. So, what does that mean for going forward? I mentioned I think the level of trust in what almost everything China does is at an all-time low, at least in the last 20, 25 years. It's going to lead to rethinking of their participation in international institutions like the World Health Organization, mm-hmm. which they have basically used as part of their cover-up. I hate to say that. But you mentioned
you're talking about the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization. It's there's a lot of those international organizations that seem not to be very international, but actually kind of biased and more submissive towards an authoritarian regime like the Chinese Communist Party, rather than being a universal organization that should be more independent, at least. Why is this a trend that we're seeing?
Well, let me be clear about at least how I think about this. I mean, the World Trade Organization is not controlled by China the way perhaps one could think of the World Health Organization. World Trade Organization is just ineffective mm-hmm. because of the way it's constituted and because of lack of willingness on the part of other members to confront China. But China has relatively neutral ability to control the World Trade Organization. Now, there's another organization in the UN, the Human Rights Organization within the UN. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly enough, the Chinese are very powerful in that. I believe that China has just been elected as the chair of that,
which is outrageous. Just outrageous.
It's totally outrageous. But China, again, is part of this systematic effort by the Chinese to gain influence through those organizations. Just earlier this year, there's a group called the World Intellectual Property Association, mm-hmm. WIPO, which helps to coordinate global rules on the protection of intellectual property. And China made a huge effort to get one of their nationals to be the chair of that. But by that time, this was in the February-March timeframe, the world had awakened to the Chinese tactics of taking over these organizations and managed to derail the Chinese candidate for head of that organization, at least. So that's possibly another example of how the events of the last couple of years have started to have an impact on the willingness of the United States and its traditional allies to work together to counter the Chinese challenge.
In your opinion, did China use the pandemic to also gain and make profit out of the world? I mean, we saw with the fake PPE masks that were sent to the United States, not to mention other masks that were also fake masks that were sold by China after everything they've done to the world.
Well, look, I'm not going to accuse China of having engineered this this pandemic for their own gain. Chinese are pretty good about taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves. But these examples of shoddy products that they put into the market, I mean, this is not the first time they've done that. And I don't have any knowledge that they willfully did that. It's just an example of poor oversight, poor application of standards of quality and consistency within China.
But what else they've done to take advantage of what's going on right now?
Well, what they're trying to do now at a sort of geopolitical level of high diplomacy is to take advantage of the weakness of our economies and the necessity we all have had. We, the United States, Japan, Europe, especially the traditional leaders of the Western coalitions, they're inward looking now because we've got to deal with the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, at least. And we're more concerned about addressing our own internal problems than we are of being active in the world. China is trying to now say, well, we have overcome this crisis and this health crisis. We know how to do this. Our system of government allowed us to react quickly. And
how convenient.
Well, they're masters of this sort of on the field changes in strategy, to use a sports metaphor. But you know, since especially the United States and Europe are so preoccupied in dealing with the health and the economic crisis, it leaves an opening for China to come in and try to advance their own standing in the world. I don't think it's going to work. I think people have wised up to the whole array of what China is trying to do economically, politically, through international institutions, suppression of human rights. I don't think it's going to work, but that's what they're trying to do right now.
There was an article at the Washington Times today by Clifford D. May who talked about creating, which is something you just touched on as well, which is having a coalition of partners, of good allies of the United States, like Britain, countries in the European Union, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Taiwan, India. So, I mean, how realistic is this for us to move forward, decoupling from China and creating a coalition of good allies who are democratic countries who could work with us in the future and not have to rely on China on so many very important and essential products that we probably don't want to rely on a country like that moving forward after what we've learned?
Well, I think there are several parts to that to an answer to that question. I don't think we're not in a position right now to organize a grand coalition like perhaps we did after World War II and with the emergence of the Soviet Union. We're not as powerful as we were then relatively. I mean, we had 50% of the world GDP after the Second World War, so we could, people had to work with us. So we organized that pretty effectively. Now, economic power is more dispersed, and as I alluded to earlier, we're more inward looking. And there have been disputes between the United States and Europe over the, pre-pandemic, trade issues. A lot of people around the world don't like Donald Trump, so they use that as an excuse to be hesitant about working with us. And we saw that play out in the difficulty we had in confronting China economically, 2017, 2018. So I think what's going to happen now is that there is an increased recognition, as we talked about, of what the real long-term goals are and how they go about them. I think we're going to have sort of ad hoc coalitions to address certain problems, like these problems I mentioned in the South China Sea, and we're working very well with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, and India to push back on that. There is, I think, a willingness, a new willingness. We talked about Huawei, but that's just one example of China appropriating or trying to gain a foothold and a dominance in high technologies. I think especially with our Japanese and European allies, there's a new willingness to work together to sort of coordinate response to that. Now,
but we are still the world leading power, and we're still leading in technology as well. I mean, there's no question about that.
There's no question about that. There is.
And how is the prospect look for us to keep leading in these important sectors, such as advanced technology?
Well, I think there's a lot of work being done, and we're going to see more and more attention paid to this in the years to come. There's two parts of the strategy. One, we have to push back against China and not allow them to take advantage of the openness that we've had, and our allies have had, where they can come in and take over industries appropriate to steal or buy technology. That's part of the strategy. The other part is reinforcing our ability to do basic research. We've lagged a little bit in relative terms in the last couple of decades. I mean, just to give one example, a lot of our high technology flowed out of programs at the end of the World War and into the 50s and 60s. You take the effort to counter Russia on satellite technology that led to an intense effort to collaborate to remain dominant in that field, and we did. The race to space, 1960s, the Apollo program, we got a man on the moon in basically about an 8-year program. And in that time, we spent nearly 1% of GDP on that program. In some of the years of the Apollo program, fully 1% of GDP, which is a lot of money. That would be about $200 billion a year in right now if we did that. So a lot of technology, telecommunications, semiconductors, aerospace in general, including jet engines, came out of those programs. So we need to reinvigorate our investment in high technology, basic research, and that I think we'll end up doing that. We'll have to see how we can afford that, and once we recover from the economic devastation of the pandemic. But I still think that the United States system, with a lot of competition and rewards to people who succeed in inventing new things, I think is still the superior system.
In your opinion, what is the most important product? We heard, for example, Nikki Haley talking about medicine, that we need to not rely on China for medicine anymore. What do you think are the realistic goals for us to achieve today?
Well, I'm not sure I'm an expert enough in medical research to know what's achievable. There does seem to be a serious effort to coordinate with some of our best friends to address the coronavirus, vaccines, treatments, and I think that's a positive sign. The US and Europe, and to a certain extent Japan, are the leaders in pharmaceutical research. We could incentivize research to come back to the United States through some forms of tax policy. We don't want to get off into the details of this, but our tax policy in the 70s and 80s basically rewarded production of pharmaceuticals outside of the United States. And we can, that's partly been reversed, but there's certain things we could do to incentivize production coming back. And I think there will be, because of national security considerations that have come to the fore this year, we will do that, and we will work with our allies. The larger question of decoupling, industrial decoupling, it is a big question. China is still a big market. We want to have access to it if we can, but US companies, European companies, Japanese companies are already reconsidering their investments in China because there have been supply chain interruptions during the pandemic, but they recognize that this has happened before for political reasons, and that China doesn't hesitate to use its control of supply chains or commodities like rare earths or cobalt to squeeze their competitors. So that process of private sector rethinking production in China is accelerated, I would say, by the events of the last 6 months.
Lastly, we are in election year right now, and this administration has been probably the first to confront China on all of these issues that have been lingering for so long. In your opinion, what is the danger of having an administration in the White House that might kind of go back to the old policy of let's talk to China, let's work with China, knowing and giving where we are today?
Well, it seems to me that there's been a sea change in the United States. I mean, let's face it, the Republicans were supported for many years the policy to try to work with China, bring them into the World Trade Organization. And hopefully we thought we could incentivize them to become better citizens in the world. Well, both sides now realize that that was a false hope. And if you look at the Biden campaign, look at the statements of Charles Schumer, they want to get stronger on China than Trump has been. The foreign policy establishment on both sides, both Republican, Democratic side.
You think they've been promising to be tougher on China?
They've promised that. they criticize Trump all the time for weakness on China. So, but if you look at the writings of the people behind the scenes, the foreign policy types, the economic policy types, there's more of a consensus that China is a problem, a long-term problem, and does need to be confronted. So I think no matter who wins the election, you're not going to see a huge change in policy towards China. And China has made it very hard, even if there was a will to do that, they made it hard the last year to think that they're ever going to change enough that we can really work with them.
I think this is an ongoing conversation, and we'll still be learning about all of the developments with this ongoing pandemic. Thank you so much, Tom Duesterberg, for joining us today, and I would love to have you in the future joining us. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us and watching. With you, Heavy Buzo and The Untold. I would love to hear your feedbacks and your thoughts and your comments about our podcast, and see you next time.